Okay. Aloha mai kākou. I'm Brianna Govea, Program Specialist at the King Kamehameha V Judiciary History Center. Mahalo for joining us in this discussion as our four distinguished panelists reflect on the 2020 election and what it might reveal about the future of voting and civic participation in our community. Sharing their ike and mana'o today are Dr. Ngoc Phan, Assistant Professor in the Department of History and International Studies at Hawaii Pacific University, Davis Price, Community Outreach Manager at the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, Dr. Amy Agbayani, Community Civil Rights and Immigration Advocate, and Dyson Chee, Coalition Director for Hawaii's chapter of the national organization Vote 16. I'd like to thank my programming partner, Aiko Yamashiro, Director of the Hawaii Council for the Humanities, for helping make this event possible, as well as the Public Policy Center at the University of Hawaii at Manoa for co-sponsoring this program. While the remarks shared tonight don't necessarily represent opinions of the judiciary, I also want to thank Chief Justice Mark Rechtenwald, the Hawaii State Judiciary and Legislature for their continued support of our mission and for providing a venue for this discussion. I encourage our Zoom audience to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your webinar screens. We'll have time at the end of our program for the panelists to answer your questions. And a friendly reminder that the webinar is being recorded and it'll be posted on the Judiciary History Center's YouTube page. So today's discussion is the second in a series of public programs that the center is hosting for the Why It Matters Civic and Electoral Participation Initiative. I'd like to turn it over to Aiko before we get to our presentation to tell us more about this series.
Aloha everyone, mahalo nui to Brianna and the rest of the King Kamehameha V Judiciary History Center for hosting this event. We got to imagine that we're in their space with them tonight from wherever we are. And I just wanted to mahalo our panelists too. I'm really looking forward to this conversation tonight. Hawaii Council for the Humanities, we're really proud to be part of this national initiative called Why It Matters. And we want to thank the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation for funding very innovative civic efforts, as well as the Federation of State Humanities Councils for administering this national program. So we are part of 45 other states and territories who since October 2020 until April, we're doing all kinds of programs to really get deep into talking about how power works in our communities, how we can really be a part of that, how we can bring more voices into that space, because we all care so much about our homes and our places and our futures, and sometimes we don't feel like we can make a difference. So I think this initiative is really about educating folks, inspiring folks to feel how much power that we have, to reconnecting to our histories, and then because we have all of that, to then feel more inspired to move together into futures, to speak with each other, to listen, to dive really deeply. And so this strand of programming, we're gonna go deep into some really important topics and some tough topics. And thank you again to our four speakers today for taking us there.
Mahalo, Aiko. So before we get into the more specific questions, I thought it'd be nice just to invite each panelist to share a little bit more about yourselves and your connection or personal experience related to this theme of why it matters. And anyone can jump in, or I can pick someone.
All right, I'm happy to jump in.
Okay.
Hello, everyone.
Dyson.
My name is Dyson Chee. I'm 18 years old. I'm the Coalition Director for Vote 16 Hawaii, which is the Hawaii chapter for the national Vote 16 effort that's across the US. And for me, really, I actually got involved in civics and politics through the plastic pollution and more traditionally environmental fields. But since then, it's kind of expanded into more youth-related issues and just things that impact our everyday lives here in Hawaii. So that's where I come from, very briefly.
Ngoc, I'm just gonna go and pick. Would you mind going next?
Thank you, everybody, once again. So my name is Ngoc Phan, and I am a political science professor. I'm a political science professor because I'm obsessed with understanding power, who has it, who doesn't have it, who's listened to, who's ignored. And I think it probably, living in Hawaii, I think deeply about ancestry and connection to land. And I am the child of Vietnamese refugees. And so any sort of political event that is sort of about, I know, you think about oppression, you think about having to leave your country and come to a different country, right? Like, I think it's in my DNA, it's in my bones. And I've somehow found a career where I get to dive deep into these questions as it relates to other people and their communities. And so that's where I kind of find myself. I became that person because I think I'm supposed to study power and where it's not happening, and sort of shed light on things. And so that's how I have come to be this person.
This is Amy, and I was going to try and be next to Dyson because he's the youngest on the panel, and I'm the oldest on the panel. I mentioned earlier that I'm in phase 1B and will get my second vaccine shot on Saturday. I'm interested in voting and the political process, and have always been interested in that. Also, similar to Ngoc, because I'm interested in inequality and equality, and that the political process oftentimes helps determine makes decisions as to the people who benefit from certain things and the people who are left out. So I'm interested in the political process, and that it's an important process that if we don't participate in, will leave us out.
Aloha, Davis Price. So I wear a few hats, and my 9 to 5 is community outreach manager for the Office of Hawaiian Affairs. But I have a long record of community organizing around political activism in the Hawaiian community. Being on a panel with someone like Dyson is beautiful and a little bit disturbing for me, because I remember being the young guy on these panels years ago. It's I believe that being engaged in politics, it's really interesting for me to hear people saying power so much as part of the forefront right now, because so oftentimes in our community, talking about power is kind of a bad word because it's been misused in so many ways. So power is not something that we often feel like we're striving for. But ultimately, I do this work because it is about exercising our voice, and the need is immense for people to participate if we're ever going to find solutions to the things that make us so angry. Yeah. It's you have to engage in the process, and there's multiple ways to do that. And have this background behind me because this Aloha Rising effort was about really highlighting the different ways to participate. And I can talk more about that later, but mahalo for having us.
Thank you, Davis. So Hawaii has historically had some of the lowest voter turnout in the nation. And you just mentioned you've been engaged and involved in the community for a very, very long time. And so I'm curious, what are your thoughts on why Hawaii has had this low turnout, and what communities in particular are we seeing that in?
Is that for me?
Yes, sorry.
Okay.
Davis, yeah.
Mahalo. It's hard to say why. And then my work, a lot of it is focused in the Hawaiian community. Pacific Islander community. And, coming from, it was something that part of my motivation for all these years is because knowing how much activism there was in the 70s, especially, and what that led to in terms of, you know, Hawaiians being engaged at the highest levels. And then, the drop off, 20 years later, I don't know what caused it, but I do know that it is part of what motivated and motivates the work that we do. And we've never been able to answer the second part of your question. We've never been able to really identify and see any data that shows whether, who's turning out at a high rate or who's turning out at a low rate. It's all speculation. And, that's something that we've worked on for a handful of years. The message that, Hawaiians don't vote or this community doesn't vote, it's almost, it's weaponized, to continue to make decisions that impact those communities adversely. So there's no proof that we've seen that shows what communities are voting at a higher rate or lower rate. Because I haven't seen any ethnic-based exit polls in Hawaii. So all of that is speculation, and we should almost either do the polls or stop saying it.
Thank you, Davis. That is a great point. Amy, did you want to add something?
Yes, I can say that the Filipino and immigrant communities are the groups that are among the lowest voters. And we know that from looking at the data as to where they live. For example, in working class communities like Kalihi, where I also live, there are a high proportion of foreign-born immigrants. And there's so many barriers facing, I have to speak as a Filipino, but I think I speak for most immigrant communities. They always are seen, for example, Asian Americans or Filipinos here or on the mainland are always seen as forever foreign, forever alien, never a citizen, even if they may be fourth generation children. And so they're not seen. And also many new the immigrants that came to Hawaii, for example, or came in as and recruited as laborers, never thought of staying in Hawaii. They were thinking of going back home. So they had a hard time having a second generation and Hawaii-born children. But now that has changed a lot. But immigrants really are unfamiliar with the voting process and sometimes don't trust government. And the big issue that I'm actually lobbying for, my previous Zoom today, was for language access for people who don't understand how to access, for example, unemployment insurance. And we do have laws now that require bilingual ballots for certain communities. And those are the kinds of things that will help increase voter registration. But the big part is that many of these communities just don't feel like they still are accepted and don't feel like they actually have that voting is relevant to them. Of course, I think it is relevant, but we have to actually encourage them to vote. And for Filipino immigrants, for example, they oftentimes don't vote in the primary, they vote in the general election. And most of the stuff is decided in the primary because in their country, in the Philippines, primaries are kind of not useful. It's the big general election that counts. Whereas in the United States and particularly in Hawaii, which is dominantly the Democratic Party, I'm a Democrat, by the way, voting in the primary is very relevant. And if you look at who votes in the primary, it is related to socioeconomic class. So, for example, Hawaii Kai voters are like 80% of them vote in the primary, whereas in the Kalihi, we're lucky we get 20-30% to vote.
Thank you, Amy. So correct me if I'm wrong, but you came to Hawaii in 1964, correct?
Yes.
And so I'm curious if you have anything to offer insight about the immigration law of 1965, its impact in Hawaii and the immigrant communities here on their voting and civic engagement, just as a sort of historical perspective.
Well, going to be historical, I'll go older than my white hair, is the Filipinos have came in, 15 Filipinos came in 1906 as recruited as laborers, although actually I do have data that shows that about 6 of them actually jumped ship and joined the Hawaiian Royal Band earlier. I actually prefer that narrative. But the official one is that 15 Filipino single males came in 2006. And of course, they were laborers and they were not allowed to vote. They were not citizens. So a lot of their voice was through the unions, the ILWU. The ILWU and others, actually, the so-called Democratic Revolution of 1954, 56, really changed it so that the workers were actually actively trying to get elected. But the Filipinos still were not really active in voting at that time, although we did have a couple of Filipino legislators even at that time. But since the 1965 law, then the change of the immigration law allowed more families to be reunited. And so instead of just single males, then there were more women and families, and actually more of them became, and also the labor needs of the US. But for Hawaii particularly, it was the bringing in family members and then second and third generation. So the immigrant Filipino community now is actually only 16% are non-citizens. The others are Hawaii born and also naturalized citizens. And they vote, as much as not enough of them vote. So the Filipino immigrant community, does face barriers to voting, but we've had some successes. The first, and I don't think he'll be the only, but he's definitely the first Filipino in the nation to become a governor, was Ben Cayetano, who was local born. And currently we have a number of new Filipino legislators in the Senate and the House and the City Council. So there's been some progress in getting Filipino community, and also these Filipinos who were elected were not elected just by Filipinos. You can't get elected in Hawaii if you only rely on your ethnic group. You have to rely on multiple groups to get elected. So they had to reach out to other communities in the state. So the Filipino community is very underrepresented in professions and well-paying jobs and so forth. But I think that the potential for their participation is there, and we just have to encourage it.
Thank you, Amy. I want to jump back to Davis for this next question about the Office of Hawaiian Affairs Aloha Rising campaign. And you mentioned earlier how that great point that, due to the lack of ethnic-based voting data, we cannot say for sure what groups or communities are or are not voting. And so what was the goal of this Aloha Rising campaign and its strategies? Oh, you're muted.
And if I can, I just wanted to clarify that, it was prior to this year, at least this last election, it's clear that half the population wasn't voting. It was just, and oftentimes in our experience, the context is, oh well, Native Hawaiians and these other ethnic groups aren't voting at a rate that matches other ethnic groups, and we don't know that, right? So that's what I meant. It's very clear that we needed to increase. We need to keep continuing to work to increase voter engagement across the board, and that's really so for us at OHA, our focus being Native Hawaiian beneficiaries. We've worked on this for many years, and much to what Amy mentioned about the reasons why people don't participate: lack of trust in government, people not talking to them, people not reaching out. That's really what it is, and the lack of trust, and really identifying a role for yourself in this process. Are there people that are saying the things that line up with your interests? Are there people that look like you, talk like you, can tell the same stories as you? All those little things that factor in, I think, to when people make decisions. Again, this is like a trial and error science experiment, right? We worked at this for years. We don't really know what works. And, we know that the proven tactics like pounding the pavement and door knocking can work, but it's really around issue-based campaigns, right? Or candidates. How do we just get people to engage and feel like it's part of their responsibility and feel good about doing it? And really that's what Aloha Rising was, building on all this momentum that came from the political movement in recent years around Mauna Kea, which we saw, people of all, a global response to people standing up for what is sacred in their culture. And then really immersing themselves in that cultural component. And it struck a nerve. It resonated with people, especially Native Hawaiians, but it's resonated beyond that community as well. And it's aligning with other movements around our country and around the world at this time. Indigenous perspectives are, the voices are getting stronger, and being, I think those perspectives are accelerating some much needed discussions through in the political spectrum, in the political world. So, Aloha Rising, how do we build on that? Let's connect Kuleana, and that was really what we aimed to do. Was let's just get our people, provide a space for our people to look at politics, dust up, would take off all the muddy clothes that people hang on it all the time, like Amy mentioned earlier, that it's dirty and it's something you want to stay away from, and provide look at it through a lens of our cultural history, and that our people were and have been engaged. And this really translates to all people. The cultural stories may differ, but governance and being engaged in leadership and community, it's part of society. So let's look at it through our cultural lens, through our history, and look at how these relationships and these dynamics have interplayed over centuries, and really identify what will make us feel better about participating, what will make us more effective in our advocacy, right? What will make us better leaders? And I think all of those components really get us to a point of starting to establish some trust. And maybe it's not trusting all of the folks that are in decision-making processes now, but identifying the need to elevate new leadership if that's the problem. And in order to do that, you have to engage. You have to know what's going on. You have to understand who are the leaders in your community, and find the ones that you can trust and that align with your interests, and support them and organize with them, and vice versa for the leaders. They got to go out there and talk to your community and find out, what it is that's going to motivate them to participate. It's really a reciprocal relationship that has to happen. And we wanted to create a space for those discussions and that kind of interaction to start to take place.
Thank you, Davis. I guess just as a little follow-up question, I'm curious what tactics, I guess, did OHA find most helpful in really galvanizing the community, reaching out to the community?
And I'll keep this short, but there was a good response to the web-based platform, and obviously the pandemic provided this opportunity for us to outreach in this way. Normally it would have been in-person community-based meetings. That's what we had scheduled for months, and we're gonna hit the road in April, and then this happened, so we had to pivot. And really, we learned how to use this new tool, and I think we can reach, while not everybody is, another big issue, digital equity, right? Not everybody has broadband access, but I think we were able to create more access for people. And then the other factor, and that obviously was huge, that wasn't OHA's doing, but advocacy over the years, is the mail-in ballots. That's the game changer, access, and making voting more accessible. That was debated for a number of years, whether that would make a difference, and the proof is now there for us to see, and we should keep pushing to make it even more accessible.
Thank you, and definitely fantastic job for OHA pivoting to that digital sphere. I know here at the center it was definitely a learning process for it in the beginning, but I think we got it. We got it now. This next question for Ngoc, I think your background is so fascinating, being a political psychologist almost, or in the field of political psychology. And just reading a little bit about that, you are interested in how decisions, identity, behavior impact groups' ability to overcome collective action problems, right? And if you wouldn't mind kind of just detailing that out a little bit more for us, what that means in the research that you do, and then sharing your findings for the 2019 Native Hawaiian survey as well. Thank you.
So I really wanted to chime in on what some previous speakers have already talked about, especially when it comes to data. Data has been weaponized against certain communities, right? The people who produce it, the people who own it, the people who pay for those fancy surveys, and they often don't have access to the communities, right? They're always saying, oh, y'all want this. And then you're like, well, who did you ask? And they're like, well, that's not who we are. And I don't know who you asked. So this is like just the street level, right? Like people think about OHA does great work on collecting data, but Davis is right. There isn't a collective data set that says, here are the people in Hawaii. This is who votes, not just by district, right? Like that doesn't mean much for us. We need to know, like, on average, what is the rate for 18 to 24-year-olds voting, right? And which neighborhoods, which groups, what are their last names, if that's what we have to do crudely, right? We do know exit polls, whoever has them isn't giving it to me, isn't it given over to Davis, right? And so I often have, kind of push people gently, like, where's the data? And they're like, oh, it's private. I'm like, what do you mean it's private? Like, that's old data. Like, that's from the 1960s, like, hand it over. Right. And so that's really like my motivation while I think about why people participate. Right. I always had the hunch that, like, when people are discriminated against, they're going to go take action. And it's going to look like different things. And it's going to look like different things. And it depends on what you're measuring. Right. Because if you're measuring the vote at the end of the day, that means you buy into the system. But maybe when people are discriminated against, they're not talking about politics like that, right? They got bumper stickers, they got flags up, they're showing like pride in different ways of resisting, and so if you keep measuring political participation just through voting, you're really missing out on the richness in which the community does engage. Because I have been here, I'm a new person, right? But I'm working really hard to understand the complexity of this place. And so I asked myself, why is it that I could not download a data set on Native Hawaiians and figure out what their partisanship was, right? It's a very simple question for me as a naive political scientist coming over here to start my job. And I could not find it. Therefore, I dug deeper and I said, why is that? And then I go, what data is out there on different groups? in Hawaii and who has it? And like, you know, I'm pretty stubborn. I kept checking and I kept seeing like, oh, well, that's a poll, but that's not really a scientific poll. Or that's a poll, but that's actually paid for by X organization. And they're not really sharing it with us. Or wow, that's a really badly worded question. And who did you actually ask? And so for me, as someone who has come here and been socialized somewhere else, I think who has more agency and voice? And I would argue, for me, Native Hawaiians should have the largest say in what we do here, in the control of the land, of the resources, right? And what type of governing structure. And so that really led me, because I didn't understand, like the identity question is like, you know, I asked a dumb question, right? What does it mean to be Hawaiian? And people are like, you're going to ask what? And how are you going to do that? And who do you think you are? Yeah, those are exactly the questions that I met up with, which made me build partnerships, right? I worked closely with Lynette Cruz. I recruited a whole team of undergraduates who were Kamehameha grads, right? And I was like, hey, I don't know nothing, but I do know data and I know how to do a survey and I know how to figure this out. So if you want, will you help me, right? Will you collaborate? Will you tell me what I'm doing right, what I'm doing wrong? And so that really led to the 2019 Native Hawaiian survey. We had a really small budget, right? There was no pandemic. We hit the ground running. We were in the community. We're on the beaches. We're harassing people fishing, right? And then we said, this is who we are. This is who's funding this. This is Lynette. This is La'a. This is Catherine. This is Leilani, right? Like, we're in the community. And so we say, this is who we are. This is what we're going to do. We want to know what it means to be Native Hawaiian and what's important to you and the community. That was our goal. It wasn't, I want to know how you vote. Because I knew historically, I can't come in and just ask people how they vote, right? They're going to be very apprehensive. And, you know, some people really didn't trust us either. But that was okay because we were there and we made ourselves known. And we're, you know, we want people to use the data. We want to show transparency. So data I saw was a way of actually disempowering people in Hawaii. Therefore, given that that is my kuleana, right? I know how to do data. I know this. I've been doing this for like 15 years. I can do this. And I can do it without permission of someone cutting a check. And so for me, that's where we came in. I think that's why we had nearly 1,000 respondents and people were so, they bought into it because they saw how valuable it was for them. We weren't going to tell them what was important. And so we have questions like, what are the 3 most important things to you? And you tell us. I don't get to tell you to check 10 boxes, right? And I think that's the power of social science and research and data. And also, like, as someone living here, that's my responsibility, not just come here and take and extract and like do what I do and go to conferences, right? It's really about, like, at the end of the day, I have to go and like speak to Lynette, right? Like Lynette was on the project. The young Hawaiians I'm like training to be data scientists, right? Like, I have to answer to them at the end of the day. And so for me, the responsibility is like, so somehow I've been really lucky to like get my research in line with actually being purposeful, that I believe. And that, you know, if my platform is to amplify the voices, that's what I'm going to try to do. So.
Thank you, Ngoc. A follow-up question to that, this idea about the value of voter statistics, voter data. How, if there were clearer, broader mechanisms in place collecting that data, more transparency, how do you think that might influence policy that we're seeing?
I think if decision makers and stakeholders fully had to realize who their audience was, and we could check, right? What's your platform? What did the people want? Who showed up? It's going to be much clearer for them to make that connection on who they actually represent. And what does it mean to be accountable? And what does it mean to be transparent? And what does it mean to make decisions that are very difficult in our community, right? Right now we're facing COVID, we're facing record unemployment, right? Amy doesn't even have her second shot yet, right? Why does Amy not have her second shot? That's not okay, right? A lot of kapunas aren't, you know, they're not excited about the vaccine, or they don't know how to get the vaccine, right? That's because of years of distrust in public policy, right? So if you make that connection closer and we show them the evidence, like this is who you're supposed to represent, are you doing your job? It's easier to keep them accountable. And then it will actually encourage more people to participate because they see that, oh, we did show up, right? And what did you do for us? So there's a relationship between those who are our elected officials, but also those who are governed and their demands to the community, even to the people who don't vote, they need to be accountable to.
Could I ask
Yes.
Ngoc to give us a couple of findings from the survey that she thinks would be related to the topic? Or
So some of the findings were that Native Hawaiians are extremely civically engaged, and they are going to cultural events. They're informed about politics. They can list you not only 3 issues that are facing the community, but multiple issues, and they could tell you exactly how important they are, right? And they are grounded in different ways of thinking about, where are they on their identity spectrum as one, right? Are they leaning towards more Indigenous sovereignty identities, or are they more Americanized identities, right? But we see that within the community, one thing that I know many people were very excited about is we added that question about TMT. The survey was not about TMT, but we saw in the respondents that nearly 88% of Native Hawaiians who were surveyed across multiple islands, that they did not support TMT. And I think the study that we had is the largest one that actually captured preferences of Native Hawaiians, right? And it was the only one that didn't add everybody else who also lived here, right? Or registered voters. And I think that's very powerful because at the end of the day, my research team, and we could say, we went out in the street and we asked Native Hawaiians, and that's what they told us. So I think like that alone, I know a lot of people are really excited about that finding, but I'm telling you, that's not why we went into the field. And that's not the only reason why people answered the survey. They answered the survey because we gave people a platform to tell us their preferences. And now we are stewards of that information. So, but you can read about it. I can send the link.
That'd be fabulous. And I want to come back to this question about what was on the ballot in 2020 that really energized people. But before we get to that, our time is, running out. So I want to get to Dyson. And you have been involved with a really interesting initiative to lower Hawaii's voting age to 16. And in 2019, a bill was introduced to the Hawaii legislature to amend the Constitution to do that. And I believe in early 2020, the bill was approved. So if you could give us some insight into what your experience was like working with people on that bill, and where does it stand today, Dyson? Thank you.
Of course. So actually, the whole effort around SB4, which is the bill you were talking about, Brianna, that actually kind of got kickstarted before I joined Vote 16 Hawaii. I'm relatively new in comparison to some of the other people who've been working on this effort, but I definitely can speak to it. So SB4, it was introduced in the Senate back in, I believe, 2019. And in 2020, the Senate passed the bill. The entire Senate passed the floor with the 2/3 majority needed for that constitutional amendment to move forward. And so it was really incredible, especially because at the time, the Vote 16 Hawaii effort was really just centralized around 2 or 3 individuals, youth. And 2 of them, I believe, were headed in their senior year of college. And so they had kind of had their hands tied in terms of academics. And so it was impressive to see that this bill managed to move forward even without that much organizing around it. And it really showed that there's interest in government in terms of expanding the franchise and allowing 16, 17-year-olds the right to vote. And unfortunately, March came around, the pandemic hit us all like a freight train, and the bill never got a hearing in the House. But once again, this year, we're back with actually 8 different versions of bills that would lower the voting age. Some of them lower it to 16, just like SB4. Some of them do it to 17. Others Another one would do it to 15, but with some additional requirements. And so there's definitely variety out there. And it's shown us that, yeah, the conversation is beginning to happen. More people locally anyway are getting engaged around the issue, and that it's gaining traction. So we're really hopeful in seeing what happens this year in terms of these bills to lower the voting age. But I mean, for anyone here, we're talking about getting engaged civically. This is definitely one of those ways to get civically engaged.
Thank you. And I have a follow-up question to this idea of a lower voting age. What do you think? What would the impact on policy and civic participation if this were achieved? What would that look like in Hawaii? And also, what is this? I think we're all astonished by how galvanized the youth is, especially in these past few years. And so what does this growing political awareness and action, power, agency of youth suggest about our society today, that we want to, some people want to lower the voting age to 16?
Sure. So
And,
I'll try
yeah,
to
Dyson.
cut that into two pieces.
Yeah.
But for the first part, I mean, kind of taking what we were talking about at the very beginning of this conversation in terms of Hawaii having awful voter turnout until the 2020 elections, when things suddenly flipped. And one of the benefits we've seen in other places that have lowered the voting age, because there are a ton of other places that have lowered the voting age to 16. I mean, countries like Austria have been doing it for over a decade, since I believe 2008, 2007. We have municipalities in Maryland that have lowered the voting age to 16. And so we can see what they've done and figure out what are the consequences of doing so. And what we've seen is that voter turnout goes up. It turns out that when you give 16, 17-year-olds the ability to vote, they will come out and vote in higher numbers than those in that 18 to 21 age range. And there's some different speculation as to why that is, and I'll get to that in a second. But a lot of times when I share this with people, they're still very skeptical. They say, well, okay, maybe you'll have more people voting, but the quality of their votes are probably going to be really junk because youth are uneducated, they're mentally incapable of making smart decisions. And to that, we've actually seen that that's also not the case. It turns out that 16, 17-year-olds make votes that are aligned with their beliefs, more so than those, once again, in the 18 to 21 age range. And the speculation around this is quite similar as well, in terms of 16 and 17-year-olds have slightly more stable lives than those in the 18 to 21 age range, right? At 18 years old, you are probably, especially in Hawaii, 1, you're off to college. 2, you're probably off to the mainland for college, because sad as it is, we have a serious issue with our brain drain. Whole nother topic we could go over for hours, but we won't, not right now. And so in all likelihood, even if you're engaged civically at 16, 17-year-olds here, once you're off to the mainland for college, you're physically disconnected, and mentally you're also disconnected, because between college, surviving college, and voting, your priority is probably going to be surviving in college. I can't tell you how many of my friends who were really engaged as high schoolers in Hawaii, once they went off to college in the mainland, I sent them, hey, did you vote? And they're like, oh my goodness, like I totally forgotten. And so I can't tell you how many of our friends have responded like that. And so that's the point of lowering the voting age to 16 and 17. It's to increase engagement in the long run, because voting is habitual. And if we can get people to vote once, in all likelihood, they're going to vote again. 2, it's to get a generation of voters who are going to make educated votes that align with their beliefs, and not just, oh, well, I have a Chinese last name and that person has a Chinese last name, so I'm going to vote for them. Like, no, not how it's supposed to work, people. And so that's where lowering the voting age comes in. And then to answer kind of the second point of your question, at the end of the day, even though voting comes with these benefits, the whole point of lowering the voting age is to provide youth with a tool, right? I think being involved with civics regarding plastic pollution, climate change, a lot of environmental issues at a young age, we always have adults telling us, oh, good job, give it your all, this is awesome that you're doing this. And we're like, yay, thank you. But it's a bit sad too when you're like, hey, you know, if it's our responsibility and our burden to take on these issues, can you please give us all the tools we need to help solve these issues? And they're like, no, like no voting age rights, no voting rights for you. And it's kind of like, well, you know, if the burden is on this generation to fix today's problems, why are we not giving them the right to vote today? Especially when the data shows that giving them the right to vote is actually beneficial to the democracy at large. And so, yeah, that's kind of where it comes in, voting. It's regardless of all the benefits, it's really a tool at the end of the day, a tool for youth to be able to have a meaningful say in government.
Thank you, Dyson. Do any of our other panelists want to add anything to this point of youth engagement voting?
Strongly for it, and we really, I think later on you might tell people on the chat or something the status of the bill and how they could get involved, because the legislative session is currently on the way, and there are lots of hearings, and they really do count testimonies. So that's one thing. And while we're on to legislation and what could be done, I'm active with the what is it called? Automatic voter registration, and that it's called House Bill 740. What they're trying to do is to allow those people who are registering for a driver's license to automatically also register as voters, and it makes it so much easier because you've got all the data there, and there are lots of ways to vet that it's correct, and it will increase easily the number of people, because it's a real hassle to do one more thing to get yourself on the voter registration. And as Davis said, you know, and others said, the mail-in vote really contributed to the increase in the voters in Hawaii. And luckily we were a year ahead of a lot of other states because we've been doing it for a while. Before it was, you had to ask for it and sort of give a reason. And then later on why you needed a absentee ballot, but now it's automatic. And the increase in voters is dramatic. And I think the less barriers we have, the easier it is, then more people will vote. A vote is a voice, you know. It's a tool. It's just one additional way to make government accountable and to express your preference and your values. So voting is oftentimes seen as boring and annoying, but if you don't do it, I think the Hawaiians came up with the phrase, don't if you don't grumble,
No
vote
no
and
grumble.
don't grumble.
No
Is that-
vote, no grumble.
No vote, no grumble. Exactly. You know, but it is important to vote.
On that note, and I you know, mahalo to all of you, and mahalo Dyson, you know, leading the charge on this voter registration, and another issue that impacts us, you know, all of us, but especially going to impact minority communities, climate change, and you know, the young people are really leading the way. So it's mahalo nui for your work, and just want to echo Ngoc sentiments about, you know, and everyone here about, it's just one tool. Voting is one tool. And agency comes in many different ways. And this is something I've kind of been expressing for in recent years, especially, is that just because people aren't openly organizing to go to the ballots, if they're openly organizing in various other ways, such as nonviolent direct action, I would argue that those are the most civically engaged people in any community. What it takes to learn an issue, advocate for it, organize people, mobilize people to demonstrate Yeah, we really got to start pushing back against the narrative that if you don't vote, you're not civically engaged. So mahalo nui.
Yeah, and to very briefly add one very short point on, I mean, all the solutions we've all come up with here are just one part of the puzzle. The puzzle will never be complete without each of our solutions, but at the same time, each of these solutions are not the silver bullet to fixing all the issues that exist in our world. It's going to take a lot of hands working together, and it's going to take all the pieces of the puzzle being put in the right places to make this happen.
I wanted to add that I get to work with young people all the time, and they never cease to amaze me or humble me. And, you know, young people have always fought for their rights and to vote, right? 21, 18, I mean, move it to 16. I think it's amazing. I also think, you know, that generation has to deal with the things we did. So let them go, come to power, let them be fully engaged even quicker. And, you know, voting is addictive. I try to get my students hooked pretty quick, right? And these things are just simple tools. And I think people here are very committed to building the community, right? And taking care of their neighbors, right? Nobody would blink an eye if you needed something on the road or you needed something. Yet we're, you know, that we're not thinking about that in the same way when we make really important decisions, especially with the allocations of resources to our communities and what we want to invest in our priorities. And so it takes all of the strategies, strategies of sort of building the community you want. And this is just one way of doing it. And so I'm so grateful to sort of be a part of this conversation. But it's not just data, it's not just voting, right? We got to buckle up, we got to gear down, and we got to check that this is the place and this is what we want. So
Mahalo. I want to close with a question, just looking back on 2020 and the context of the year, the struggle of the year, yet the huge engagement in various ways that was seen, and that is continuing, and that took place before 2020. What do you think this kind of blip in increase in that voting sphere means moving forward? Do you think we can take a lesson from this? This is something that's going to continue? Is it too soon to tell? Yeah, I'll leave it with that. Thank you.
I think the mail-in vote is it has made a major impact, and it can only grow. But I was also going to point out that the 2020 elections should have brought to everyone's mind that voting counts. The people in 2016, Mr. Trump got more votes in the Electoral College than, although Hillary Clinton got more votes around the nation. In 2020, Biden and Harris got more electoral votes and more votes, and the former president wanted to eliminate our votes, not listen to the process of the peaceful transition of power. So voting counts if the elections count. So and also one of the things that has to be done is to connect voting with many of the more important issues like Black Lives Matter or TMT supporters. Sometimes they don't connect, and as Dyson said, there's not just one tool. We have to connect with these issues, and sometimes they're not connected. But the Black Lives Matter thing locally, for example, was led by teenagers. High school students were the leaders. And I've been to hundreds of demonstrations in Hawaii, but that one was the biggest.
I'd just like to add that I've always said that Hawaiians and Filipinos voted in a block, that would be the biggest block in Hawaii.
They are.
So definitely, we should.
In the public schools, we're half of the population, and
Right, and it's the
actually-
most underserved. I mean, you're right. Sorry to cut you off. Go ahead. Go ahead.
No. And actually, sometimes I say it's not who you are; it's when you are.
Right.
Hawaii is the most ethnically mixed state in the nation. And you can ask a little 6-year-old, they'll tell you they're part this, part this, part this, part that.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's not who you are, it's when you are. For example, some of the biggest and the most important Native Hawaiian leaders have Filipino last names. And they are very proud of also their Filipino heritage. But oftentimes you cannot do multiple things, and we appreciate their leadership and their competence, but the ability to reach out to underserved communities and to build coalitions, that's the way to go. Like for the TMT, you got major support from non-Hawaiians. And for Black Lives Matter, only 3% of the state or 4% of the state are Black. So a lot of the support for Black Lives Matter and George Floyd was with non-Blacks. So we have to have coalitions.
Yeah, and I just want to add, like it's really about, the ethnic groups are obviously everybody is tied to their cultural identity, but it's really about common interests. And I think that's where, when I didn't mean that lightly, but like, Filipinos and Hawaiians, like you said, make up 50% of the public school education system. And that's 1/4 of the state's budget every year. And that's always under threat, right? Like, and we've never approached it from that perspective, right? I know that there's been Hawaiian activists, a mentor, kumu of mine, many years, Lili Kala Kame'elehiva, always used to call on the Board of Education and call it out and be like, we're 25% of that population. That's 25% of the state budget. You're talking billions of dollars, right? In allocation, regarding allocation of resources. And are we agents? Are we effective agents of the management of those resources? And so that's just one example of, issues where we can. It's not just about, okay, you Filipino, I'm Hawaiian, high five, or Chinese, Japanese, and let's go get together. It is, where's our common interest and how can we make things better? Where do things need to get better for our communities? And we can align around that. The biggest existential threat to us that Hawaii knows better than anywhere else in the world, climate, sea level rise, climate change, we're going to deal with that. Our communities are going to deal with that. Kalihi, right? Like it's sea level. Right, rural communities throughout Hawaii are Hawaiian, Filipino, Japanese. This may be the great common enemy that we needed to galvanize politically in a way that hasn't happened in many, many, many decades. But we will all be impacted. But I think when we're already talking about communities that are already underrepresented, it's even more critical that we organize and mobilize to start to make sure that our communities are prepared to deal with that problem. And lastly, increasing access, back to the voter engagement. It's any measure, legislative measure that will make voting more accessible. Absolutely, 100%. Must pass. And I think I just want to close. I think I read a data set from the Georgia elections that at the general in November, since between the November general and runoff in January, I think like 8,000 people turned 18. And I think the gap for a couple of those races was right around 8,000 people. So that's the difference, potentially. We don't know exactly if that was the exact difference, but I mean, close enough. The young people can make a difference. So support you folks.
And also, actually, the immigrants, 139% increase in the last decade. And so that if any politician had any brains at all, and they did, the Democrats in Georgia reached out to the immigrant community because they actually brought in, it's a very competitive place, and 1 or 2 or 3% really makes a difference. So every vote counts, every vote.
Thank you, Amy. Well, I'm not seeing any questions, and we are at time. So unless the panelists want to add anything else, I think we're going to have to bring this discussion to an close. And I want to say thank you so much to each of you for the work that you've done and the work you're continuing to do in our communities. It's an honor to be speaking to each of you tonight. I'm very grateful for the roles you guys have in the community. And thank you for sharing your insight tonight about elections and civic engagement. It's a discussion that's going to continue to be had for sure. A lot of progress to be made. And with that, I just, again, mahalo, take care, have a wonderful night.